president of FEW was Janice Mendenhall. Janice has been employed by the General Services Administration and the Civil Service Commission, which is now the Office of Personnel Management. She was OPM's first director of the Federal Women's Program. She served as national president from 1974 to 1970.
I first joined FEW in 1969. I'm a longtime member. I'm a lifetime member. I joined when I was, I just started with the government as a trainee in Kansas City. There was no chapter there, and we worked on getting one started, but I believe I left town before we actually got a Kansas City chapter started. I transferred to Washington in 1970 in the spring, and I'm sure I must have attended the first FEW program that summer because I was detailed back to Washington as the full-time Federal Women's Program Coordinator for GSA. I found it very interesting at that time in 1970 that there were 4 agencies that had full-time Federal Women's Program coordinators, and they were not the social action agencies that you would have expected. They were HUD, State Department, Small Business Administration, and GSA. Barbara Good was the one at State Department. Mary Pinkard was the women's coordinator at HUD, and I forget who it was at SBA. But we worked very closely together, and there were a lot of part-time women's coordinators around in Washington, D.C. 1970 was also memorable to me because it was the 50th anniversary of the Women's Bureau, and they had a big celebration that September that I also attended. Elizabeth Duncan Kuntz was head of the Women's Bureau at that time. Back then, the status of women in government was slightly different. There were still some regulatory restrictions. There were height restrictions on certain kinds of jobs, which discriminated not only against women, but certain ethnic groups of men. Women couldn't be in jobs that required the bearing of firearms. That sounds like a long time ago, and I'm very happy that my agency, GSA, changed that rule for building guards 6 months before the Civil Service Commission changed it in May of 1971. In October of 1970 at GSA, Allie and I worked together to put on what was probably the first federal women's program in the government, and we chose October 13th because that was the anniversary of the Executive Order 11375 prohibiting sex discrimination in federal employment. We phoned out to all the regional offices and got photos of women in non-traditional jobs and had a display and a short program in the auditorium. I was active in FEW for many years. There were not that many of us involved, and it was mainly centered in Washington. So I wrote a booklet on the Freedom of Information Act. At that time, FEW was trying to come up with anything we could sell to raise money. Fundraising has always been a prime consideration of most of the presidents. Carol Watkins and I prepared a workshop on how to prepare a 171 and came up with the idea of cutting the forms apart and putting the heading on a blank sheet of paper so you have more room to fill it out. And I was looking at something recently, saw that people are still putting on that workshop, and it still is relevant. I edited, and I don't remember who the other people were who worked on it, a booklet called Congressional Hiring Practices. We had done some analysis about the executive branch and women in different level jobs. We thought, well, what are they doing in the legislative branch? Let's, pull all this data together and see if the members of Congress who say they really support women's issues actually pay the people on their staff equally. Do they have any women in top level jobs? As an offshoot of that, there was an article in the Washington Post about congressional hiring practices and how they discriminated against, because of course they exempted themselves from the legislation from the '64 Civil Rights Act. I wrote a letter to the editor that was published in the Washington Post talking about what hypocrites the members of Congress were passing laws for everyone else and exempting themselves. And a man that I had dated 4 years earlier saw the letter to the editor and phoned me up, and we started dating and later got married. So one of the things we were supposed to talk about was the impact that FEW had on our lives, so I could say that was a very big impact it had on my life. I would say my term as president could be characterized by what I would term organizational development, trying to strengthen and mature the organization. It was a time of rapid growth. We grew from 52 to 125 chapters in those 2 years, and I was very glad of that. I had been vice president for chapter organization previously. We began electing the regional managers. Priscilla had begun appointing them, but not all the regions had them. We got regional managers in all of them and began the election process. There had been chapters, and when you get up to 125 chapters, you couldn't have all of them represented on the board. It just got to be much too unwieldy a meeting. So we thought by putting a regional structure between the chapters and the national, we would have a more functional organization. Also, I personally thought that the president should not have the power of appointing so many people on the board so that you could have a majority just from the one elected person. I thought it was a better balance of power. We began electing the national officers by mail ballot. Previously, it had been done at the business meeting at the national conference, and they were all held in Washington at that time, but that meant everything was skewed toward the Washington, the East Coast area, and anyone who couldn't attend the conference was not able to vote, so we began mail ballots. We began a part-time paid executive director, and that was a big step for us because paying somebody $20,000 a year, which I think was the first salary, we geared it to about a grade 12, was a big financial undertaking for the organization. We began training the national officers and working on a procedures manual on how to get chapters going. May worked on that very much as one of the vice presidents. The Few Legal and Education Fund, LEF, was started during this period of time. Carol Watkins and I had worked, and some other people had worked on a class action suit against GPO. We had done a lot of work and analysis. Basically, it said that there were the old print machines that the printers used, and they were going to a new kind of technology that we probably know as desktop publishing today, which involved sort of typing things, and they didn't really have screens, but it was using a keyboard sort of thing. And they wanted to only let the printers who were wage grade, all men, apply for these new kinds of jobs, whereas secretaries who had worked for years on typewriters and were very familiar with keyboards were not deemed to be eligible to apply for these jobs. We thought it was a classic class action complaint. Few was growing, and we were becoming international. I don't remember when it started, but I know we did have the chapter in the Canal Zone, was one of our first outside the United States chapters, and they were very active, came to all of our national meetings. In 1976, we had our first national conference outside of Washington, D.C. in San Francisco. We had had regional programs before. This was the first national one, and over 2,000 people attended. It was a very emotional time for me as an outgoing president to see Few becoming this large organization. During my time, one of the things that seemed to be very confusing to people was the difference between the federally employed women and the federal women's program. So I drafted a sheet of paper that had two columns on it. One, this is Few, and this is the Federal Women's Program. And Helene Markoff, who was director of the Federal Women's Program at the Civil Service Commission, and I signed it jointly, and that was the first FWP-FEW agreement that was signed. I had the honor to represent Few at the International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City in 1975. I participated in meetings at the White House and testified before Congress. As my term was drawing to a close, I applied for a job at Civil Service Commission and was selected as director of the government-wide Federal Women's Program. And as a matter of fact, I even held both jobs for 1 month because of the timing. I was national president of Few and of the Federal Women's Program. I feel that the voluntary experience I gained through Few was extremely valuable management experience. I think it's almost more difficult to manage a volunteer organization where you don't have quite so many awards, you don't have performance appraisals, you may not have people in the same city, you don't have a lot of the same carrots and sticks that you do when you are running an ordinary office. And I think that management experience was very key in my moving on to being director of administration at GSA in 1977, a super grade position, and I became one of 2 pregnant charter members of the senior executive service. I guess in reflecting back on my many years in management, the one thing I would say besides voluntary experience being very important and vastly underrated is I feel I've been able to do more for women and for EEO in general, having gotten out of the EEO program and into general management where I have some power to hire and train and move people around rather than when I was in the official EEO program. Thank you.